Okay, recording has started. So thank you everyone for joining us. This is the QFEG Youth and Field Education Professional Development Series. Today's session is on young people and global shapers. My name is Frankie and I am a representative of the Combined Universities Field Education Group. And we have Daniela Palos here, who's an ACAP student representative who will be supporting the session today. So I would like to invite you to do an acknowledgement of country, please.
Yes, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodian of country throughout Australia in their continued connection to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people today. I'm grateful to be in Gadigal country. Thank you, Frankie.
Thank you. And we have a chat function, so I encourage you to acknowledge the land that you are on. I am on direct land. While you do that, a bit more information on housekeeping. As mentioned just now, the session is recorded, so if you don't want to appear on screen, please feel free to turn off your camera. However, please ensure that you're staying on mute while others are speaking. And the session is counting towards replacement errors, so we will be taking random attendances throughout the session. So please ensure that you're staying throughout the session and actively engage in breakout rooms. And lastly, the materials and recording will be distributed through email after the session. Right, that's the housekeeping done, and we would like to warmly welcome our panelists for today. We have the team from Voices of Influence, a youth-led organization, and Nagina Kosa, a representative of the City of Sydney International Student Leadership and Ambassador Program. So thank you, everyone. And I think I will first like to invite Nagina to introduce herself, please.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Nagina, and I'm from Pakistan. I'm an international student ambassador for City of Sydney, as Frankie told you about this. I'm here to represent City of Sydney's ISLA program, which aims at empowering international students by capacity building, representation, and enhancing positive experience of international students in Sydney. On the side note, I'm also a social work student and doing my very first placement at the moment. So happy to attend this event and thrilled to be part of this discussion.
Thank you, Nagina. And then I'll pass on to Alice Langton, who's the founding director of Voices of Influence, to introduce herself and her team. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you so much, Frankie, for that warm welcome. Hello, my name is Alice, and I am the founding director of Voices of Influence Australia. And we are joined here this evening with a few of our colleagues on our leadership team as an organisation. So Voices of Influence Australia is a youth-led organisation that really functions to move the masses that are passive individual consciences into being active collective voices for human rights in Australia and globally. And we are thrilled for the work that we've done so far, and even more excited for the work that's coming next year and in 2023 as well. But a bit more about myself. So similar to Nagina, I am a recent social work graduate, and I am currently studying international law at the moment. And I guess my career has kind of dabbled in a few different areas. I started working in mental health, then transitioned into international development, working with Child Fund Australia, which is an international organisation which is a part of the Child Fund Alliance, which is about 14 different offices globally that work in international development, but also with a human rights focus on the rights of children and the Convention of the Rights of the Child. But really my proudest achievement has been setting up Voices of Influence Australia. We're a very young organisation, not just in our demographic, but I've been around for less than a year. In fact, our 9-month anniversary was a couple of weeks ago. So, but we've had, it's been a very exciting journey up until this point. And I'll pass over to one of my colleagues because we wouldn't have been able to achieve without all of our hard work. So does someone want to jump in there?
Hi everyone, my name is Taylor. I am the Legal and Political Affairs Director at Voices of Influence Australia. I'm also a recent graduate, though I'm a graduate in law. I graduated last year from the University of Wollongong, and I started at a commercial law firm working full-time this year in March. I'm a soon-to-be lawyer, so I should be admitted early next year, so that's super exciting. In terms of my work in human rights and sort of grassroots activism, I guess probably since high school and then across university, I've been involved with a number of organisations in a mentoring capacity. So I've done some mentoring for AIM, YWCA, and some societies at uni. And then coming into more of my senior years of my adult life, I have recently, well, I say recently, but not really. It's been probably 9 months since I joined New South Wales Young Lawyers, which is the largest peak body for early career lawyers and law students in Australia. And there I am the vice chair of the Communications, Entertainment and Technology Law Committee. So that's super exciting. And I am also a volunteer at the moment with Share the Dignity, which is a incredible not-for-profit doing amazing work in the period poverty space. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Happy to go next. Thank you, Taylor. Firstly, I just wanted to say hello to the students. It's so good to see a few of your repeat faces and names again. For those that don't know, my name's Athena, the Health and Social Services Chair at Voices of Influence. I am also a social work graduate. I do some part-time work at Domestic Violence Centre, and relevant to today's topic, for the last 2 years, I've worked in primary healthcare management. And in that role, I lead a team of 20 combined doctors, nurses, allied health and admin staff. And the fun fact about that is that they are actually all older than me. So I completely resonate with the statement that young people do face a lot of challenges when they're thrust into these leadership positions. So I'm quite interested to hear other panelists' perspectives and takes on, you know, how we can become more seen and heard when it comes to whatever position we are in or going to jump into in the future.
Oh, it's jumped onto me without me even speaking, so I'll go next. My name's Kelly. I'm the chairperson for gender equality at Voices of Influence. I'm super excited to be here. I'm really excited to hear what everybody has to say. These conversations are always really exciting. Anyway, my background is in journalism. So I'm a recent journalism and social justice graduate. My experience has mostly been in community news and documenting like grassroots community activism and different social justice movements. So that's really revolved mainly around like housing and homelessness, women's rights, and particularly where that intersects with the experiences of First Nations people over here in Perth, Western Australia. Before that, I was working for Plan International over in London. Plan International is a children's charity with a strong focus on advocating for the rights of girls. They're pioneering some really cool research into period poverty and sexual harassment against girls all across the world. So it was a really exciting time to be kind of like working for a organization that it was kind of like pioneering research in areas that I was really passionate about. My specific role at that time was in communications and community engagement. So I've got a fair bit of experience in kind of like the media side of things, and content creation revolving around like gender-based issues. So anyway, super excited to hear from all of you guys, and speak later, hopefully.
I'm happy to jump in. Oh, sorry, Meg.
Oh, Kathleen, go ahead.
Happy to jump in. So my name's Kathleen. I completed a diploma of youth work and I'm almost finished my Bachelor of Social Work. When I finished my diploma of youth work, I started working in domestic violence and youth homelessness, but my main focus has always been child protection. So working in case management in child protection, and now I'm a team leader and managing a house of young people whilst in the interim, whilst we look for a permanent foster care placement for them. And I second what Athena says, everyone around me is older than me and I'm managing all of them. So it's really difficult, and I'm keen to hear more. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Meg. I'm the Development and Outreach Director for Voices of Influence. So I graduated last year from UNSW with a Bachelor of Social Research and Policy with a major in International Relations. My central area of interest is the climate movement and environmental activism. So I've been volunteering with a grassroots organization called 350 for about a year now. And like particularly within that space, I'm quite passionate about youth involvement and uplifting the voices of young advocates. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Marie. I'm the Chair for Peace, Conflict and Security at Voices of Influence. I graduated with a Bachelor of Social Work and most of my work has been in the disability sector. So I've done a little bit of behaviour therapy, some academic coaching for the accessibility department, and now I do a little bit of that. Plus I make individual learning plans for students with disability. I'm completing my master's in peace and conflict, and I'm currently doing my research in terrorism and counterterrorism strategies. So I'm really interested in looking at the role of communication to create some strategies that work from the bottom up and work with communities. So yeah.
Fantastic. As you can see, we have a really diverse panel this evening, and I'm thrilled that we're also be able to join here with Nagina. So you're not only exclusively hearing from our team of Voices of Influence, I'm sure we'll have some really interesting and diverse conversations evolve through the panel and through our breakout rooms as well. Just for the next 10 minutes, I just wanted to give a quick presentation about youth leadership and young people as global shapers, and then we can get to the exciting stuff, which is the panel to jump on the floor and talk. So like I said, we've just done a bit of an introduction of things. I'll go through what youth participation and youth leadership is. Then we'll go into 2 breakout rooms. We'll do one and then we'll do another one, and then we'll come back in the main room to discuss the conversations that emerged from there. So youth participation, what is that? So to start off with, participation is an absolute fundamental human right. It is one of the guiding principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that has been reiterated time and time again in other conventions and declarations. Through active participation, young people are empowered to play an absolutely vital role in their own development, but also the development of their communities, helping them to learn vital life skills, develop knowledge on human rights and social justice, citizenship, and to really promote positive civic action. And to participate effectively, young people must be given the power and the tools to do so, such as information, education, and also access to their civil rights. Those are really fundamental to youth participation. I found this fantastic video, which I think will do a much better job of summarizing youth participation and its importance in a even more global world. And this really picks up on a few of the important conversations, which will no doubt we will explore and dismantle even more in our conversations. So we'll just watch that to begin with.
Be affected by.
As a generation, young people or millennials or whatever name you want to put to them, we need to speak up, we need to stand up for human rights, because it is our responsibility to have a better world out there.
Young activists today are the drivers of movements for justice, for rights, the environment, and an end to discrimination, just as every strong movement for human rights and solidarity in history has been spearheaded by the young.
I think it's important that young people have their voices heard, because we are the people that are going to be affected by the decisions made, and we have the responsibility to maintain the decisions that are made.
You know, one of the biggest challenges that I think young people are facing is that the 2 or 3 pillars that really can change things fast, say one is the media and the other is the politics. Both of them are extremely top down. They're extremely top down. The media does not work bottom up. Citizen voices are absolutely missing in what the stories and what news is relayed on media. Same with politics. A lot of the politics is extremely top down. Public decision making is not really there. Participatory policy making is not really there, and that's all the more reason for us to engage with these processes. So I think the first step really is to change these systems, to make them bottom up, to really make sure that there is enough public participation that we are having on a day-to-day basis.
The negative stigma around youth from society, that youth are considered inexperienced and qualified to make decisions on behalf of the whole nation. Youth are considered qualified enough to find jobs. Youth are considered qualified enough to start households, but they're not considered qualified enough to participate in decision making. Most ironically, that when we are talking about politics again, it's not just an abstract context. concept, politics is talking about education, about healthcare, about the life of the society in itself. So if youth are part of this life, then youth are definitely able to take decisions and make decisions on these important issues. Today, young people, they make the largest chunk of the population of the world. So if we are more than half of the world, then it means that we should have a voice, and it is our right to have a voice in the decisions of the world. I think that I see it from a human rights perspective. This is my human right to be part of the decision-making processes.
Awesome. All right. So as I said, that video did a bit of a job that I could have done summarizing the complexity of youth participation and youth leadership. But just to kind of stem on from the conversations that were emerging from that video, I just want to bring attention to the current barriers in place for youth leadership and youth participation, particularly with human rights and social justice and civic participation. So essentially, to improve youth participation in the governance of social justice, there are conceptual and structural barriers that need to be removed, and the groundwork that facilitates meaningful participation needs to be introduced and supported and protected. So I'll first talk about the conceptual barrier that's there. And so that conceptual barrier is that we need to change the way that we think about young people. And that was definitely a conversation that was emerging from the video that we just watched. And so that shift is it's really far from seeing youth as potential problems or a bulge or a threat that needs solutions, but it's seeing youth as how it must be reconceptualized as potential solutions to existing problems. So that's the conceptual issue that we have to kind of navigate. The structural issue is overcoming the shrinking democratic spaces open to young people, and the protection of freedoms of opinion and expression and association and peaceful assembly are necessary precursors to youth participation. So that's a little bit more of an example of the kind of barriers facing youth leadership at the moment. But I guess essentially what we need to question is, so why does the world need young change makers? And it's a very big question, but I guess to put it in a nutshell, young people are creating change everywhere that we look. Some of them are dedicating absolutely everything they have to tackling the most pressing issues of our time. It's what they eat, it's what they drink, it's what they breathe, it's how they function in every single day. And these young people, more specifically, they're change makers, they're activists, they're social innovators, they're disruptors, dreamers, doers, people who actually believe that social and environmental change is possible and isn't just this utopian picture that we've been told that it is and isn't achievable. And so I think that in itself is probably the most refreshing leadership that we've seen in a very long time. So let's just talk a little bit about the current statistics. And so 95% of young people believe that young people between the ages of 18 and 30 have the capacity to change the world or to be global change makers. 62% of people don't feel like their voices are heard on the global stage. And 43.7% of people lack access to opportunities that equip them with the skills or resources needed to make an impact on the world. I wanted to kind of move away from that video we just watched, even though it was great to give us a little bit of a context of what we're talking about this evening. But I came across this really fantastic study called the Possibilist Study. And I apologize, for some reason, that's a really hard word for me to say. So if I stutter over it, forgive me. But yeah, it's the Possibilist Study. And it was a study conducted this year in 2021 by an alliance of 16 of the world's leading youth social innovation networks. And it was driven by the desire to really better understand the lives and realities of young change makers. What are the barriers there, and how do we make this a reality globally? So I wish I could spend this entire panel talking about the study, because there were some really interesting findings that came from it. And I will share it around with you after this panel if it did interest you, because it's not very long, it's about 20 pages, but some really, really crucial information and research that's coming out of it. But just for this evening, I'll talk about a few points of that. So the first one is the demographics. So of the demographics across these 16 young change makers networks globally, 53% were female, 45% were male, 1% were non-binary, and the other 1% chose not to answer the question. And when we're looking at the origin, so 1% is in Oceania, so that's where Australia is based, 7% were in North America, 8% were in the Middle East and North Africa, 11% were in Latin America, 17% were in Asia, 25% were in Europe, and 30% were in the sub-Saharan Africa. region. And then age. And age is really an important one because that's really the biggest factor of discrimination that young people are facing in terms of participation and leadership. So 10% of this study found that 10% were between the ages of 16 and 20, 28% were between the ages of 21 and 25, 36% between the ages of 26 and 30, and 26% were between the ages of 31 and 35. So, like I said, I'd love to spend more time really extrapolating the findings that came from this research, but really there are two main ones that we need to be mindful of. And the first one is that most change makers focus on education, seeing as it is a major lever for reducing inequalities and creating change. And the second finding was that young change makers are not primarily driven by their own employment needs and wishes, but rather they're driven by an intrinsic desire to improve the lives of others on a global and local scale. So a little bit more information that came from this. So 74% of these initiatives were contributing to pressing global issues. 78% were working to mobilize and empower others for change making, almost working as like incubators for other youth initiatives. And 67% were doing something for the community. And then when we look at the kind of main issues when they were focusing on, so 53% of these initiatives were focusing on quality education, 38% were focusing on reducing inequalities, and 37% were focused on good health and well-being. So we've talked about like what are the barriers, and we've spoken about what is youth participation and youth leadership. We've looked at the barriers and obstacles in place to make that a reality. We've now looked at a case study that says these are the kind of things that are happening or that are occurring for people that are already working in this space. So I think now we need to talk about what are the challenges that young people are facing when they are in leadership positions or in change maker positions. And so from this study, again, 3 things were really identified. The first was that 59% were juggling various responsibilities and being stretched way too thin. 54% were at a very high risk of burnout, and 60% of people lacked the personal financial security for these initiatives. So just to take a minute to go through these a little bit more. So obviously financial insecurity. So of that study, only 9% of young global shapers can compensate themselves through their initiatives. 66% of young change makers cannot cover their financial needs solely through the work of their initiative, which is, I found, rather heartbreaking statistics. The other one was multiple responsibilities. So 79% of young change makers have other ongoing professional commitments in addition to their initiatives. So they could be studying full-time, working full-time, balancing home life. A lot of us already wear a million hats, so you can imagine what the kind of reality might be for other young change makers. And under this as well, only 21% of leaders can dedicate themselves fully and exclusively to their initiative. And the last one was burnout. So 59% of young social change makers in the study reported having experienced different degrees of burnout since they started working on their initiative. So I'd love to, that's it on my end in terms of a little presentation. I hope that gave you a little bit more context of what youth participation is and what youth leadership can look like. Before we go into breakout rooms, we're just, as a panel, we're going to discuss a few of the issues that came out in that video and through the slides that I shared just then. And I think something that I constantly reflect on in this youth leadership space, and I would love one of my colleagues to kind of launch off with this next question, is what do local and global leaders, many of whom are from an older generation, what do they need to know about young citizens, voters, and future leaders, or even young people stepping into that leadership space now?
I would love to kick off with this one. I think the first thing that young people are desperate to communicate to the older generation is that the social, political, and economic landscape has changed dramatically since their time. And we have to deal with some different social issues, some of the same social issues, but to a greater extent. And I think that survey that emphasizes the multiple responsibilities, it's really interesting, because when you sort of take a step back and think, well, why is it that so many people are stretched thin? Perhaps because we do live in a capitalist society and the cost of living is very high, and it just keeps getting higher and higher. And that sort of like the first example of this changing landscape is, the median house prices, for instance. In Sydney, the median unit price in the 1990s was around $135,000 for the entire unit, not the deposit, the entire unit, when people were earning around $26,000. In 2021, the median unit price in Sydney is around $800,000, while the average wage has increased not so much, just merely to 69K is the average. So, you know, our housing system and our government should make sure that everyone has safe, secure, affordable housing. And that is one example of where the landscape has changed and our needs have changed and they're not being met. And we, like in that example, we need a strong safety net of social and public housing for people who can't afford private rent as well. And that contributes to the rates of homelessness, particularly in Sydney, where it's very, very high. So I think that is the first thing I would highlight there.
While we're talking about changing landscapes, on a little bit more of a positive note, I think young people are starting to get a little bit more disgruntled and starting to speak up and, you know, voice their frustrations around these things. And Alice, in that video that you showed, the lovely gentleman on there, he said something about that the media isn't currently bottom up, but I think that landscape is also slowly starting to change. If you look at like who's in power, where it used to be institutions and governments, I think young people sort of have their own sort of culture and they talk about things that are relevant to them and they share all of these messages through social media. So I think we sort of disregard what they are saying and we are slowly starting to take power back into our own hands and banding up together through other means, which is social media and, you know, campaigns and whatnot. And if you look at things like Black Lives Matter and like the climate change rallies, young people were, you know, huge drivers in that. So the landscape has completely changed. It could be for the better, could be for the worse, but I think we're slowly starting to take power into our own hands through our own means. Yeah.
I think going off that as well, like not only has there been a change in landscape, but there's also been a change in attitude. So what older generations need to, or current leaders, older generations need to recognize about young advocates is that they're not afraid to like hide their anger and hide their passion, because whilst some people might think that that kind of negates their opinions, it doesn't. They're just so frustrated about the current situations and the current issues that they're facing that they're happy to just express that through anger, which, yeah, some people might see that as a lack of knowledge, and instead of saying something worthwhile, you're just yelling. It's not that. It's just that sometimes you get very frustrated, and anger can be a great tool. It can be a great way to express that passion, and that's something that young advocates really are leaning into nowadays.
I do agree with the point Meg made, because I remember that last, I guess, year or two ago, when during the Greta's speech, there was an absolute apparent anger in her voice and tone, and there were a lot of discussions around it, and I saw even one of my educators say that, well, young people, they are childish, they don't know. But then again, the video we watched in the beginning, there was this lovely young girl. She said that it's their decisions, the future, that the decisions they're being made, they're going to affect their lives in future. So we do deserve the space and opportunity to talk about it and be a part of those decisions. So I think that does come to it, that it's all about, because if it's going to affect the young generation, then they do have the right to be part of those decisions, to have that participation or have the space on the table. So frustration does come with it sometimes.
I think also going off your slides, Alice, how you showed the burnout statistics, which are very alarming. And Athena, what you were mentioning as well, the nature of how youth do things is quite different. So even if you look at advocacy, simply protesting, I wouldn't say is the main form of advocacy these days. It takes a lot of time to organize and to be there. You know, if we look at social media and Me Too movements and Black Lives Matter, it was so empowering in the sense that so many people were able to access that, and it definitely had a lot of limitations, but so many people were able to access that so quickly through social media, which is something that tends to be in that innovation and creativity does come from the younger generation. I think the days of young people are to be silent and speak when spoken to is definitely still a mentality that's around. And while that mentality is here, I don't think there's going to be that collaboration of the last generation's experience with the new generation's creativity. I think is the first thing that needs to go in regards to creating change, is that youth do have the right to speak and not just be silent.
Absolutely, such important conversations to be emerging from this space. I think like an underlying thing from all of this is that like we're at this axis of where leadership is about to have a really exciting transformation. And I know in previous conversations that we've had, like with some of my colleagues on here, talking about like that how leadership looks different now, especially leadership looks different in young people. It's had that shift, and it's now more about accountability and embracing humility and having that vulnerability in leadership as well. It's about increasing those democratic spaces for marginalized and vulnerable groups. And I think ultimately it's about moving from that individualist leadership style into that collectivist leadership style. And I know, Kelly, you and I the other day had a personal conversation about this, but I don't know if there's anything you want to add to the conversation tonight in this panel.
Sure thing. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on a kind of drawing from that comment about leadership needing to be collectivist in this generation, which means bringing people along with you for the journey rather than operating from kind of like an individualistic approach of sort of being like, yeah, the sole leader of something. And I think something that really underpins that is the role of love and compassion in leadership. So I think that as leaders and future change makers, we really need to be like envisioning a world that is centered on love, because when we're operating from a place of love, then we're caring for the well-being of others. And there's a couple of kind of like thought leaders in this space at the moment that are talking about the role of love in leadership. So Bell Hooks has a book called All About Love, and Clementine Ford has a book called How We Love, and it all kind of centers on this idea that love is not individualistic, that the very act of like loving a person is to extend yourself out and realize that there's a connection that exists between you. It kind of like draws on that idea of like no man is an island. So like recognizing that like you cannot exist alone, that you exist because of those who have gone before you, and you exist because of the people that walk alongside you and support you. So coming from this kind of love ethic, when we go out into the world as leaders and change makers, that's what's going to help us produce a society and culture that is strongly rooted in truth telling and helping others to thrive. And I think when you kind of look back on history and look at some of like the really pivotal leaders in the last 100 years, you've got like Martin Luther King and Gandhi, who are both like really strong examples of people who led from a place of love and peace. But in the Australian context, there have also been hundreds of First Nations leaders over the centuries who have also led from a place of peace and love. And when you tune into the voices of First Nations leaders, there's always such a really strong discourse of love for community and culture and land and spirit, as well as truth telling, which is driving those calls for change. And of course, there's anger there as well, and a very justified anger in not being listened to, and anger with decision makers. But I think that just demonstrates the fact that love and anger can coexist in your leadership. And I actually just wanted to share a quick excerpt from the book where I learned about love ethic, which is from Bell Hooks. I've got it right here. She's a very well-known African-American author, professor, feminist, social activist, and a lot of her writing focuses on like the intersectionality of race and capitalism and gender, which are kind of like the underpinnings of the systems that we're trying to change today. And she also looks at how within our culture and society, we continue to perpetuate systems of oppression and class domination. So tune in, and I'll copy and paste this quote into the chat so everyone can read it, but it goes: "Awakening to love can happen only as we let go of our obsession with power and domination. Culturally, all spheres of life, politics, religion, the workplace, domestic households, intimate relations, should and could have as their foundation a love ethic. The underlying values of a culture and its ethics shapes and informs the way we speak and act. A love ethic presupposes that everyone has the right to be free, to live fully and well. To bring a love ethic to every dimension of our lives, our society would need to embrace change."
individuals who choose to love can and do alter our lives in ways that honor the primacy of a love ethic. We do this by choosing to work with individuals we admire and respect, by committing to give our all to relationships, by embracing a global vision wherein we see our lives and our fate as intimately connected to those of everyone else on the planet. So I'll leave you guys with that one, and I'll copy and paste it into the comments.
Can I just jump in and say, I'm sorry, Alice, I know you want to move on. Kelly and I have not spoken about this book before, but I read this book a few months ago, and I have a page in my notes with quotes from that book, and the title of the notes page is How to Lead with the Love Ethic. Because it just had a profound effect on me when I read it as well. And we haven't had that conversation. But I think that is just so wild that she just pulled that out.
We're aligning. We're in alignment.
It's a really good book. I highly recommend it.
Highly recommend. I put it in the comments. So everyone go have a read.
No, thank you for bringing it up. And it is something that is so important. And I think that like what you just read, Kelly, from that book just completely encapsulates that shift of leadership and coming from a place of love rather than anger. It made me all feel warm and fuzzy inside actually listening to you read that. So it's, when Kelly brought this up to my attention the other day, I immediately bought the book as well. So for those of you that are either already in this youth leadership space or work with young change makers or are wanting to find that inspiration to move into this space, this book is definitely the catalyst for that. Before we move on to the next question, I just want to touch base with the chat. So Michelle said, yes, thank you for raising love and leadership. Another Kelly in the chat said, No Man is an Island is a book by John Donne. So interactions and relationships form to help us thrive. How can we facilitate connection? So another fantastic resources. And another one, Kelly also said that resistance is a normal behavior when feeling oppressed, and that couldn't be more true as well. So many interesting conversations can emerge from this space. I guess in the interest of time and moving swiftly along, we've spoken about the shift in leadership that's happening. I think the next question, which naturally progresses from that, is what challenges do young people and young leaders or young change makers currently face related to issues of diversity and equity and inclusion, and how do we think that we should address these challenges to face an effective future?
Taylor, did you want to go? Or?
Could you see my brain?
Yeah, you were ready, but I was also like, no, go.
I'm happy for you to go. You can go.
We're both excited about what we're going to say. Okay.
One of you go.
Basically, I really wanted to jump in there because I wanted to talk about healthcare services and the health sphere. I think one of the biggest challenges for young people in healthcare is when you look at who is at the top, who makes the decisions, who shapes the healthcare industry and whatnot, it's always the experts. It's always the doctors, the researchers, the scientists with years and years of experience behind them and their fancy university degrees and whatnot. And it's a bit of a catch-22 for us young people. And this is the barrier. It's that in order for us to be heard in that space, then we need to go down that path of, getting the degree, doing the research, making ourselves heard. And for us to do that, there's so many barriers for young people. There's, those experiencing financial difficulty, gender discrimination. So for us to be heard in that space means us having to overcome all of these barriers and end up as the very people that are oppressing us and that, are not listening to our voices. I think now what's starting to change is that it's starting to move towards people with lived experience being welcomed in as experts on their own health, and especially in the mental health arena, this is true. So that tide is changing. However, how can we address these challenges? I'm still searching for answers in the healthcare space. So, if anyone has any ideas, please do let me know. But Taylor, continue on.
Sure. No, thank you for that. I think that's a really good point to make. I think that a big challenge in issues facing diversity, equity, and inclusion is the sort of incessant messaging of the status quo that's pushed through mainstream media that sort of reinforces gender roles and racism and respectability politics, and all of which are largely slain by colonization as well. And that's why sometimes diversity and inclusion young people expressing how much they want that to be listened to can be met with so much hatred and violence, because you expect that kindness might transcend ignorance. Well, you would hope it would, but it's definitely not always the case that when people don't have something nice to say, that they still say it. And I think that ways that we can address that is with education and just a passionate commitment to the causes, to keep having uncomfortable conversations with those around you. Obviously, you only have so much of a reach as a young person that's starting out in any field, but you are likely to have friends and family and colleagues, and they're all those people that you can have those uncomfortable conversations with, and that's your chance and opportunity to educate that group, and then they will go and have those conversations with people that they know, and it's a huge ripple effect, and it's something young people have been doing for a very long time, and it's sort of how you find like-minded people and you can get passionate about the same issues. So I think that is definitely a way to address those challenges. I think stay curious and stay critical. Always, we ourselves have our own internal biases that we have learnt through the system that we live in, and there are things that we have to unlearn, and there are ways for us to grow as well. So there are always things to be learning and unlearning in life, and I think that if you as an individual make that commitment and that promise to yourself to keep doing that for as long as you're around, then you are most definitely doing your part in one way or another.
I found this, when I first read this question, I was very conflicted in what I thought I would think the answer to be. I've mentioned in some previous panels about how it's become so trendy to be politically correct and to get involved and to be active, to protest. It's very trendy amongst youth in today's generation. But it can be a little problematic sometimes in regards to diversity and equity and inclusion. And I was thinking about this question, and I came across a Martin Luther King quote, and he spoke about how the dangers of sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. And sincere ignorance is, I guess, a bit of an issue that can pop up amongst youth because it is so trendy to get involved. When Black Lives Matter came around, everyone did want to post a black square, and everyone does want to get involved, but then what are you going to then do? I was at a protest once for Aboriginal rights, and they said to all the white people here, you've come and I know you feel good about yourself, but what are you actually going to do to help make change? So I think for this question, something that can be challenging for in today's generation, I think it's really important for youth leaders to really express that, yes, you've gotten involved and you've, created a voice and you're here to create change, but we need to now go the extra step. We can't just post a black square. We can't just say me too. We need to go that extra mile. And what are we actually going to do to make change and to help for equity and for inclusion? So I think that can be a challenge for the leaders of in youth leadership. Yeah.
Add to that, it's really scary as well. Like if you look at your own jobs and the position you're in, if you don't agree with something that's going on and you want to speak up and you want to, say something about it and be like, hey, wait a minute, that's not right. Going off what you said, Marie, like, what are you going to do about it when push comes to shove? Are you really going to say something about it? So it's definitely a challenge. We have it in there. We have it in our hearts. We know, what our morals, values and ethics are and what we're supposed to do. But when we're faced with action, maybe we go into a bit of a fight, flight, freeze sort of response, and do we really go on with it? Yeah.
such interesting points. And I think that, like, I resonate with what you said, Marie, about finding yourself conflicted with this question about what the most simple solution could be to really dismantling the issues of diversity and equity and inclusion. And it's by no means a conversation that we're going to be able to resolve this evening. But I think it's great that we're able to have these kind of just these constructive dialogues around these issues. I wanted to bring to the panel, and I know in previous conversations we've had as a team, when we were discussing this particular issue, we talked about this whole concept of us versus them at the moment with young people and decision makers. And I guess this kind of again taps into what we had from our previous conversation about leadership from love, and that shifting from that individualist leadership into collective leadership as well. But a lot of the themes that came out from that conversation were about young leaders being lifelong learners and leading by example, and I guess active listening and investigating our own behaviors and responses. I think it's something that I think is a conversation that doesn't get as much light as it deserves. And so I just wanted to like interject and like put that to the panel again to see if you had any commentary on the how we can dismantle that us versus them paradigm in regards to issues of diversity and inclusion with youth leadership.
I guess it would start with you needing to embrace that concept of community, and that most things need to come from community rather than the individual, because obviously as people we experience hardships and social issues usually in forms of groups, marginalized communities or vulnerable communities, and so I think once you understand that the only way sort of up and out of things is by being together, and sort of working in solidarity with people that are also experiencing those issues, or if you're an ally, working in solidarity with the people that the issue affects, and you sort of understand how transformative that can be, then that is sort of how you're able to embrace that us, not me mentality.
Definitely. No, I couldn't have said it better myself. And if no one else has anything else they wanted to add on to that, just like listening to the conversations emerge from these last two questions, I know we kind of explored it in the beginning and looking at what youth participation was, and that video kind of explored the necessary or the critical need of youth participation and leadership. But I think all of us in the panel have experience in like being young leaders in one capacity or another. And I think perhaps that those attending the panel this evening would find it valuable to hear from our own experiences, why we think youth participation and youth leadership is necessary to face the future effectively, and what kind of role does ownership play in that space as well.
I think to start off, and I know that every one of my colleagues here tonight, the sort of thing that underpins this is that we are the future, and that very fact should power us with the right to have input on the planet and on the equal status and opportunity for women, and all the other social issues. We should be one of the key drivers of those narratives and these solutions. You can't make effective, safe, or pragmatic decisions for youth if you aren't letting the youth be a part of the conversation, the exact same way that you can't achieve any First Nations justice without having First Nations people leading the way. So that is probably, a fundamental thing to highlight here. And participation is a fundamental right. It's one of the guiding principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's been reiterated in lots of other international conventions. So through active participation, young people are empowered to play this vital role in their own development as well as that of their communities. And yeah, that is what I would say there.
Sorry, Athena, I'll just interrupt you. I just think there are so many points that you brought up there, Taylor, particularly about participation as being a human right. But I think for me, and a theme that's come through tonight as well, is that idea of continuously passing the baton, so to speak, to decision makers, to activists, to advocates in this space, that shift of responsibility, that shift of power, that handover of social impact. And I think another thing I want to reiterate is that this idea of youth leadership isn't a new concept. It's not new at all. It's not as if we're being really radical and that those of our decision makers are a little bit timid and scared by this new concept. It's not new. It's we've seen fantastic and amazing traction of social impact from youth leaders, and so I think it kind of speaks to itself when you look through history. Yeah, it speaks to the credit of youth leadership. Sorry, Athena, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just wanted to add on to what Taylor was saying. But I will
totally fine. Like, to answer the question, why is youth participation necessary? Like, I just think young people are so cool. Like, I was speaking to my little brother the other day, and he was just so funny, and he was twerking on the couch, like on FaceTime, and I was like, that's amazing. Besides the point that they're so lively, fresh, full of energy, young people, I think that we just have fresh takes on things. And I know this doesn't relate to human rights, but when you even just look at social work as a profession, where we've come from and where we're going, you know, social work was rooted in, you know, the traditional welfare roles. And, you know, thanks to all these newcomers and young people exploring different things, it's branched out, and we're starting to move into areas like health. What else? We're moving into international human rights. So I think young people are just so vibrant, and they just bring such fresh takes on all these different topics. And that's why it's so necessary to have them in any human right cause and have them speaking up, because, you know, otherwise we're just going to be stuck on repeat, talking about the same issue, you know, being in the same headspace, the same opinions are going to be coming out all the time. So, yeah.
I think, oh, sorry, Kelly, go for it.
Was Kelly going?
Oh, it wasn't me.
I just get really confused. Kind of just going off what Alice was saying before, I think that denying young people the opportunity to participate denies them the opportunity to learn skills and to learn the knowledge that is involved with human rights advocacy. And by doing that, as a society, we're just worsening the future for ourselves, because the earlier that people have the opportunity to learn these skills, that, you know, the better they are to handle situations that perhaps right now our current leaders aren't handling very well. So if we gave young people that opportunity to get involved as early as possible, and not just get involved, but actually be heard and make change and have an impact, you know, we're just setting ourselves up better in the future than we have done so currently.
I think Meg makes such a good point there. By empowering youth to identify and respond to community needs, it's going to help them become empathetic and reflective individuals, and sets them on that course to continue that important work in the future. And then that's going to define them when they're the older leaders having to listen to the youth. So yeah, absolutely great point, Meg.
Thank you all for contributing.
Are you jumping? Sorry.
I think perhaps just in the interest of time, we might, like, I know it's very interesting to keep talking about it, but just in the interest of time, we might move on. And perhaps this is like, if you have other things to bring.
Oh yeah, go for it. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I think I just wanted to bring to attention also that someone just put in the chat that I just think that it's interesting that everyone present is in that group who identify as young people. It would be great if more people from older generations were present to hear what everyone has to say. Note that I'm a little older and recognize that much can be gained from listening to diverse perspectives. Will it be great if our decision makers had that same mentality that you had? I think that's really one of the things that we're wanting to bring home here, is that just having that humility to recognize that not one person can have the knowledge of a whole entire community. Not one person can lead every subgroup of community. And so it really does take that collective effort. Clearly there's so much rich conversation coming from this conversation, and I would love to sit here and continue to talk with all of you, but like I said, in the interest of time, we'll keep things moving, and so we are going to break out and go into breakout rooms. Now we're going to be going into 3 different breakout rooms. One will be looking at youth leadership in the international community space. One of the breakout rooms will also be looking at youth leadership in health and social services. And then the final breakout room will be looking at youth leadership on the front lines. So in that grassroots activism side of the social world. So Frankie, if we can go ahead and open those up, I'd be excited to continue the conversations in there.
I include in the chat, and I will open now all rooms. I think everyone can see there. If someone needs some help to go to the room, let us know, please. Everyone is going. That's great. Now it's
Fantastic. I hope you all found those breakout rooms valuable. For the next, I guess, like just 15 minutes we have left of our panel this evening, I wanted to hear the really interesting or exciting conversations that were emerging from the breakout room. So I'd love to open the floor to my colleagues, but perhaps starting with Athena and Kathleen. I know you two had a room together talking about health and social services and youth leadership in that space. So I'd love to hear more about how those conversations went.
Kathleen, you can talk. I've been talking so much. Please go on.
I think we ran out of time. I was talking to the last second. I was just going and going. It didn't stop. But we spoke about some challenges, I suppose, that Athena and I have faced being young leaders and, you know, young managers in the industry. And we gave some really great examples. And one of them was just, and I won't go into detail, but one of them was just an experience that I had when I first became a manager, and the false accusations from other people in the organization stating why I got that position. It's not like, you know, they couldn't see that I worked for that position. They just thought all these other random things, and how to face those challenges, and how hard it is that we feel like we're very accountable and we have the world on our shoulders. And I suppose for me in child protection, it can be the difference between removing a child and keeping them safe for the night, or trying to decide if they're safe enough to stay where they are at that present time. And it can be a matter between life and death, and it's people's lives that we're dealing with. So we spoke about the pressures that it has. And Athena, if you wanted to add anything else. No, no worries.
Beautiful. It sounds like some really interesting conversations were emerging from that space. And I think particularly in health and child protection, like as social workers or in the community sector, you are those frontline defenders. And I think young people increasingly are becoming more present in that space. So I'm glad that you were having those really critical conversations. Thank you for that. I want to move on. So Meg and Kelly and Nagina, you were talking about youth leadership on the front lines, and I'd love to open Nagina, do you want to open the conversation with the different ideas and themes that were emerging from your breakout rooms?
Yeah, sure. So we had very good discussion around how to amplify the voices, how to actually voice out our opinions and the things, like the ideas or things we want to advocate for. And in the first breakout room, there was a discussion around the challenges. So some of the challenges were some people who had these brilliant ideas and have the causes they're very passionate about, but they don't know how to approach that or how to voice out that thought to the people in authorities or people in power. So we discussed the ideas of submissions and how to approach those challenges. I think that was a really good one. In the second part, there has been a lot of discussion and learning from the attendees about certain, I guess, books and stuff. We could do more about that.
Fantastic. Meg and Kelly, do you have anything you want to add to what Nagina just shared with the rest of the panel?
Yeah, like Nagina was saying, we learned a lot from the other panelists. I actually put like a link in the chat, and I think it went to everyone. But Sadiqa brought up a really beautiful activist named Dr. Sarah King, who promotes this means of like social justice through meditation and action. Was that it, Sadiqa? Yeah, and so we put a link in because we thought that would be a really great inspiration for people to draw from. Yeah.
Kelly, you might have to share the link again, because I think it only went to everyone in my call group.
Let me drop it back in.
Thank you.
And then I'll put in Sadiq. Did it come up?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Meg, is there anything you want to add to that?
I think just one of the final things we were talking about is how, as like a young activist or advocate, it can be quite intimidating to be speaking to people who are older than you. We were saying, like, even for us, like doing these panels, sometimes you can sit there and go, do I know what I'm talking about? Am I actually saying things that matter? And do people actually care about what I'm saying? And that like is a common challenge for anyone in the youth advocacy space. It's really hard sometimes to know that what you're saying does matter and you do know what you're talking about. And just recognizing that that's a shared experience for a lot of people. And you don't, whilst you sometimes will question yourself, you shouldn't. You're doing great. Even if maybe sometimes you fumble, you still are at least, you know, stepping up to a plate that a lot of people don't feel comfortable doing, and it's something that we need people to be doing. So keep going. Yay.
Absolutely. That was something that actually came up in our breakout room as well. And I talked about that as young people, we've almost been conditioned into this constant state of imposter syndrome, which is, and sometimes that is from the gaslighting of those that are older than you and the colleagues that are older than you, and questioning your worth, questioning the value of your knowledge. I kind of had shared in our breakout room that I've definitely had personal experiences where I've been the youngest in a room or a round table and have constantly been shut down, and or people have undermined my contributions. And I've left rooms thinking, my goodness, like, what am I even doing in this space? Like, no one's listening. Do I even know what I'm talking about? But I think like the reason I shared that again is because I want to bring it back to what you just said, Meg, which it is a collective experience. And every young person you speak to in this space that has had that experience in leadership has experienced it. And I think, you know, in that same breath of how we were saying in the beginning about challenging our own behaviors and challenging and reinventing what leadership is, I think it's a very normal reaction to have that almost that resistance of I think differently to these people, but it still has value, and in fact it has value to create the change and revolution we're wanting to create. So no, it's a shame that it is a collective experience, because imposter syndrome is something that's really hard to challenge in our own capacity, but a very important conversation nonetheless. I think the breakout room, sorry, excuse me, was between Marie and Taylor and I talking about youth leadership in the international space. So Marie or Taylor, do you want to kick off the conversation with the kind of themes that were emerging from our breakout room?
I think that it's interesting because our breakout room was labelled youth in the international community, but we definitely did touch on sort of what we should be doing as a collective on the domestic level, and sort of how we should be approaching our daily lives and our work in this space or outside of it, in order to further those movements and in order to then access that sort of international level participation and, you know, come with meaningful and impactful insights, I guess. But something that we did focus on was we really discussed at length that it sort of ties into what me and Alice are saying, that imposter syndrome, and that when you attend a protest, for instance, you're obviously the main point of the activism there is your presence. Like, it's that mobilization of the masses, and that is incredibly effective, and you are there as an ally, and it's, you know, relatively effortless to just merely attend something rather than put yourself forward and advocate, like, physically as in vocally. And something that we encourage you to do is that even when you maybe feel like you don't have a thorough enough understanding of an issue, it's not the time to step back, but it's sort of the time to step forward critically and dissect what it is this social issue means and requires. You know, for instance, with our First Nations community, it is incredible to attend those protests for Aboriginal rights and Black Lives Matter. But then you need to couple that with understanding the importance of an acknowledgement to country. Can you give one respectfully and personally? You know, are you well versed in Indigenous incarceration and the effects that that's had on First Nations people? And yeah, just knowing what stolen land you stand on and you work on. And it's those sorts of things that
even when you are working on that at a personal level, that is activism, because you form part of this world. You go and interact with other people, be it First Nations people or others, but you're going to take that knowledge and that commitment to that cause in your dealings with people, and that in itself is going to have a positive externality on society. So even if it's not, because it shouldn't be you writing or speaking on behalf of that community, they have their own voices, and they should be leading the charge on that narrative and those solutions, but it's you actively listening to what they're saying and putting that into practice in your own life.
Such fantastic points. Marie, before I jump in, is there anything that you want to add to the points that Taylor just said?
I think, Taylor, you summed it up pretty perfectly, but I think something that I just want to add that wasn't part of our breakout rooms is that something that I think youth get a lot, and I know that I definitely got told this a lot, especially when I started jumping into those advocacy volunteer roles and all of that, is people will be like, you're focusing on women's rights, but what about climate change? And you're doing this. And it's kind of like that language and dialogue to kind of shut down what you're doing. I think it's really important that there's always going to be an issue that you may be not advocating for on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, but what you're doing is enough. So I think it's really important that when those dialogues happen, and I hear it all the time, not just to me, I hear it said to other people, is that I think in a way that's a way to shut down youth for the efforts that they're putting in, and those efforts are simply enough. But in relation to international arena, I'm going to resend a link that I shared, and it's about what the UN is doing currently in regards to youth participation and leadership. And something that Alice did mention, which is really important, is it might look like a lot, but it's not. It is a lot, and it's really interesting to kind of get involved and have a look and read through the different programs that they do. They've got like 4 main programs, but there's still a lot of work that could be done to increase youth leadership internationally. So in peace and conflict, it's kind of a push to kind of use youth to decrease conflict and have youth present in conflict resolution. But even though I send this with the UN list, there's a lot more that can be done. So I don't want to give the wrong impression by sending that through, but yes.
As a side note for what Marie was saying earlier about, what about this issue and what about this issue? That's something that's commonly referred to as sort of like the oppression Olympics. And it's often something that's weaponized against young people by the older generations to sort of destabilize their movements and their, apparent commitment to the causes, etc. So just recognize that anything that you do for any one of those causes is making change and making a difference, and it's doing a lot more than it would be if you were doing nothing at all. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
No, Taylor, it must be something in the air, because he literally took the words right out of my mouth, talking about the oppression Olympics. But I think and another thing that came through from our breakout rooms, and I think it is very relevant for all the ideas that came through from the other ones as well, is this idea of like sustainability and youth leadership as well. And in the first breakout room, one of the questions was, how do we look after ourselves if we're, very young, stepping into the space, potentially have 10, 20, 30, 40 years in this space left, and how do we see ourselves having a sustainable career in that space? And I shared with that room, we had I think it was last week, in a meeting as an organization, we got a fantastic compliment, which was that we were going through our agenda and programs and projects we've got running. And they were like, oh, fantastic, you're doing great work. You've been around for like, what, 4 or 5 years? And again, had to quite bashfully say less than a year, but thank you, as a massive compliment to us. But since that conversation, as a team, we've had to have perhaps a more less lighthearted conversation about the sustainability of our model as an organization. And we've done significant work in this last 9 months, which has really built the legitimacy of us as an organization and those partnerships and initiatives. But the next conversation we will be having is, how do we keep ourselves sustainable? We can't, the current reactive model that we have, which I think is reflects a very common like business model also, or not-for-profit model that other youth initiatives have, which is reacting to social justice issues and jumping on campaigns and jumping on projects. And whilst it's incredible fun work in the beginning, it's not sustainable. So as I think in the topic of talking about youth leadership across the board, that's a conversation we need to continuously check in with ourselves about, talking about the sustainability of social justice, of activism, of human rights, and of young people in this space. So many fantastic topics obviously came out from those breakout rooms. We have a few minutes left of this panel, and so I'd love, perhaps we might not be able to get around to everyone, but if any of you have a final takeaway that you'd love for those attending the panel tonight to be able to take home and sit with, what would that be?
Everything that you do counts. Everything, every conversation, every time that you decide to double take an informative Instagram post that's teaching you about the perspectives of the transgender community, or, you know, First Nations justice, you taking 2 minutes to read that properly is something. You attending a protest is something, and all of it matters. And none of it, no movements could come together or mobilize the way that they do without each individual person doing their small part.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to jump in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, imposter syndrome is something that I completely resonate with, and to all the students here, when you look at, positions that you could take on as a leader, if not you, then who's going to do it, and why not you? So, who's going to do it? So you might as well just go and just do it.
Absolutely. And that was definitely one of the inspirations for Voices of Influence Australia, is that there wasn't a space for young people who had this calling towards the protection and promotion of human rights. There wasn't a space for it. So, as in Athena's words, if no one else is going to do it, you may as well do it yourself. So that's a good lesson to take home. I think for me, unless someone else wants to jump in, but for me, I think the biggest takeaway goes back to one of the first points that we made in that first question, which is that ethic of love in leadership. I am someone that truly believes in the power of love and compassion in leadership, and how that can transform the local community and the global community. I think it's something we will send through a resource after this panel with the links of the books and other resources which have done some really fantastic work around how love and compassionate leadership can grow and mobilize people for social change. But at least for this evening, I know it's gone really quickly, but we will have to wrap up for this evening. It's been such a fantastic couple of hours speaking with all of you. I think I can speak for all of us on the panel that we've learned a hell of a lot from those attending tonight as well. Hopefully we'll see more of you throughout the panels we've got between now and the end of the year. But if not, I'm sure you will all make fantastic leaders, whether as young people yourself or supporting young people stepping into this space.